It was 1945. The Pacific War had reached its dying breath, yet for many the end of battle was not the end of suffering. On a quiet island somewhere in the vast Pacific, the sun had not yet climbed over the horizon when the order came. Line up, at dawn. The word spread through the makeshift barracks like a chill crawling over bare skin. Inside the dim quarters, Japanese women prisoners of war stirred from uneasy sleep. Some had been nurses, others clerks. A few had once served tea to officers whose faces they could no longer remember. But now, stripped of rank, stripped of certainty, they were prisoners in a foreign land, facing a morning that would decide their fate. Outside, the air smelled of damp soil and ashes. The remnants of burned documents still clung to the ground like ghosts of an empire fading into memory. The guards moved with mechanical precision, their boots echoing in rhythm with the rising wind. As the women emerged, barefoot, trembling, clutching their tattered uniforms, they could hear the distant cries of gulls. The world felt suspended between night and day, peace and punishment. None of them knew why they had been ordered to assemble, but all of them sensed that something irreversible was about to begin. The dawn of a new order, and the end of everything they once believed. The women stood in silence, their breath visible in the cool dawn air, the faint tremor of fear running through the ranks like an invisible current. The sky was still half asleep, streaks of indigo and gray stretching over the horizon, as if reluctant to reveal what the morning would bring. The jungle around them was quiet, too quiet, as though nature itself was holding its breath. Somewhere, a bird called once, then fell silent. The sound of boots crunching against gravel broke through the stillness, and every head turned instinctively toward the line of soldiers approaching from the barracks. No one spoke. They had learned that silence was safer. Silence, obedience, stillness. The Japanese women prisoners stood barefoot on the cold, damp earth, their thin uniforms clinging to them, some patched crudely with scraps of old fabric. Their hair, once neatly tied, hung loose and matted. The war had ended, but for them, peace had not yet arrived. They were the forgotten ones. Women captured in the chaos of retreat, nurses and clerks who had followed their units into the Pacific's scattered outposts, and now found themselves under the watch of an army that had once been their enemy. A gust of wind brushed through the clearing, carrying the faint scent of salt and smoke. The smell of burned documents, orders, letters, insignias, lingered from the previous night when the guards had fed the last remnants of the empire into the flames. Those who still clung to loyalty had watched the papers curl and blacken, their faces illuminated by the firelight, their lips trembling with words they dared not speak. The officer in charge, a tall man with a sharp face and cold eyes, stepped forward and began pacing before them. He said nothing at first, only looked at each woman in turn, his gaze assessing, dissecting. A translator followed behind him, clipboard in hand, ready to record whatever verdict might be given. The women stood straighter, though exhaustion made their bodies ache. They had been told to line up at dawn, no reason, no explanation. In war, orders needed none. Even now, in defeat, obedience was a reflex. The officer's boots stopped before a young woman in the middle of the line. She looked no older than 20. Once, she had been a nurse in a field hospital near Rabaul, stitching wounds and whispering comfort to dying soldiers. Now, her hands were raw, her nails broken, her face pale from hunger. The officer's shadow fell across her. He said something in English, a question. But she did not understand. The translator repeated it in halting Japanese. Her reply came softly, trembling. Hai watashi wa kango deshita. Yes, I was a nurse. He nodded once, then moved on. Her knees nearly gave way with relief. She did not know why she had been spared whatever judgment lingered in his eyes, but gratitude mixed with dread. Because for the next woman, the question might be different. The line extended far beyond the eye could see. There were more than 100 of them, all drawn from various corners of the empire's collapse. Some had been stationed with medical units, some had served as communication clerks or translators, others had simply been swept into military work when there was no one else left to fight. They had seen soldiers fall, watched their wounded carried away, and in the end, they too had fallen, not by bullet or bomb, but by circumstance. The officer's voice echoed again, calm and deliberate. As the translator repeated his orders, the prisoners were to remain silent and await further instruction. Anyone who spoke without permission would be removed from the line. The meaning was clear. No one moved. The wind tugged at their sleeves, the rising sun now painting the mist in hues of orange and gold, and for a fleeting moment, it might have been beautiful, if not for the rifles glinting in the same light. They stood for hours, the sun climbing higher, their shadows lengthening on the ground. Some swayed with exhaustion, others clenched their fists to stay upright. The guards paced, their expressions unreadable. It was not cruelty that made them cold, it was habit, routine, the mechanical discipline that came from too many dawns like this, in too many places where war's debris still lingered. As the heat rose, flies began to gather, sweat trickled down the women's faces, but they did not raise a hand to wipe it away. A single movement, even accidental, could be mistaken for defiance. The younger ones tried not to cry, but the tears came anyway, quiet, desperate tears that left clean lines on dusty cheeks. One of them whispered a prayer beneath her breath, a prayer for home, for family, for the memory of the sea beyond Yokohama, where she had last seen her mother. Behind them, the camp stretched like a wound across the landscape, rows of wooden barracks, surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers at each corner. The air buzzed faintly with the hum of insects and the metallic creak of the watchtower as a soldier adjusted his rifle. The flag that once flew above the camp had been torn down days earlier, its colors burned, its fabric used to bandage the wounded. Now, a different flag fluttered in its place, foreign, commanding, heavy with the authority of victory. The women tried not to look at it. Some could not bear to. It was not hatred they felt, not anymore. It was something quieter, heavier, the grief of recognition that their world was gone. The empire that had promised them honor and protection had collapsed overnight, leaving them stranded between memory and survival. An older woman, her gray, streaked hair tied back with a strip of cloth, glanced at the others. She had been a teacher before the war, a volunteer who joined the nursing corps when her students were conscripted. She looked down the line, at the trembling shoulders, the hollow eyes, and thought of how many of these faces once belonged to girls who believed in glory. She remembered the songs they sang when they boarded ships years ago, their voices rising in bright unison under banners that now meant nothing. She wondered how many of them understood that the war had been lost long before the final surrender. The officer stopped again. This time he spoke more sharply, gesturing for the translator. The clipboard rustled. A list of names was read aloud. 10 women selected without reason. They were ordered to step forward. The line parted slowly as the chosen few moved hesitantly, heads bowed. One stumbled and was caught by another before she fell. The guards said nothing, but the rifles shifted in their hands. The women were led away toward a small building near the edge of the camp. None of them looked back. The rest waited. Hours passed, the sun blazed overhead, and still the 10 did not return. No one asked where they had gone. In war, questions had become dangerous things. The silence stretched long and suffocating until the officer returned and dismissed the assembly. The women were allowed to eat, if one could call the thin broth and rice a meal. They ate in silence, each bite heavy with uncertainty. That night, when the camp lights dimmed and the guards' voices faded, they lay awake on the hard wooden floors of the barracks. The sound of distant waves carried faintly through the cracks in the walls. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, an engine rumbled. A truck, perhaps, or a transport heading toward another island. One woman whispered the names of the 10 who had been taken away, her voice trembling. No one answered. They all knew that speaking their names aloud was an invitation for grief to settle, and grief was a luxury they could not afford. Days would pass before they saw them again, thinner, paler, but alive. The 10 women had been interrogated, questioned about their roles during the war. Some had been accused of aiding soldiers who committed atrocities. Others were merely suspected of knowing too much. When they returned, they spoke little of what had happened. The silence between them became its own kind of language, a fragile understanding that survival now depended not on loyalty or faith, but endurance. And yet, even in that desolate place, life persisted in small, defiant ways. One woman began humming softly at dusk, a lullaby she remembered from childhood. Another found an old piece of charcoal and began drawing on the barrack wall, the outline of Mount Fuji, faint but recognizable. The others gathered around, their faces illuminated by moonlight, and for a moment they were no longer prisoners. They were simply women, daughters, sisters, mothers, clinging to memory in a world determined to erase them. The dawn that had begun with fear ended with something else. Something quieter, something stronger. In that fragile hour between night and light, they had discovered the truth that no conqueror could take from them. That dignity was not given by victory or taken by defeat. It was something born from within, in the silence, in the standing, in the waiting. They had been ordered to line up at dawn. They had obeyed. But when the sun rose and its light touched their faces, it revealed not the broken remnants of a fallen empire, but the enduring shadows of those who refused to vanish. When the news of Japan's surrender reached the camp, it came not as a roar, but as a whisper, a quiet, trembling murmur that rippled through the barracks long before the guards confirmed it. At first, the women did not believe it. The idea was impossible. Japan's surrender, the very word felt like a betrayal to everything they had been taught, everything they had endured. For years, they had been told their nation would fight until the last breath, that death was preferable to dishonor. Now, the empire that had promised eternal glory was gone, dissolved overnight under the crushing weight of reality. In the dim light of the barracks, they gathered in small clusters, whispering in disbelief. Some clutched their rosaries or amulets, their fingers trembling as they prayed for clarity. Others stared blankly at the floorboards, lips parted but voiceless, as though the language itself had failed them. They remembered the speeches that once stirred them to tears, of unshakable victory, of sacrifice for the emperor, and they remembered how proudly they had believed. But the world had shifted beneath them, and belief now felt like an echo from another lifetime. Later that afternoon, the guards confirmed it. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. There would be no rescue, no triumphant return home. The empire was finished. The announcement came from a loudspeaker set near the center of the camp. The words, spoken in broken Japanese, were simple and final. Some of the women gasped. Others laughed, short, hollow laughs that cracked under the weight of disbelief. A few fell to their knees. It was not victory or defeat that they felt, but emptiness. The sudden, absolute collapse of meaning. The surrender stripped away even the illusion of purpose. For years, they had told themselves that their suffering served something greater, that every wound and every sacrifice added to the strength of their nation. Now, all that suffering seemed wasted. The flag they had saluted, the emperor they had revered, the soldiers they had tended, all had fallen into silence. Night fell without ceremony. The guards moved through the camp with unfamiliar hesitance, as though unsure what came next. Their prisoners were no longer enemies of a nation at war. But what were they now? Victims? Survivors? The world had changed overnight, and no one knew the rules anymore. Inside the barracks, the air was thick with heat and grief. The women lay on their mats, unable to sleep. From outside, faint murmurs of conversation drifted through the open windows. The guards speaking softly among themselves, the foreign words incomprehensible but heavy with tension. The women tried to listen, hoping for a clue, a hint of what would come next. None came, only the distant cry of a bird somewhere beyond the camp, a sound that felt almost cruel in its freedom. One woman, her face thin and hollowed by months of rationing, whispered into the darkness, "What will they do to us now?" No one answered. They all knew the question was too large for words. The next morning brought no clarity. Instead, it brought silence, a new kind, deeper than before. The guards did not bark orders, they simply watched. The women were allowed to wash at the river, something that had been forbidden for weeks. The water, though muddy, felt cool and alive against their skin. For a fleeting moment, they felt human again. Some splashed each other gently, laughing through their tears as though their laughter might trick time into kindness. But the laughter did not last. When they returned to camp, they saw the foreign soldiers gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. Some pointed toward the women, others toward the sky, where the clouds drifted lazily above the barbed wire fences. There was an unease in their movements, as though victory itself had unsettled them. A few days later, a truck arrived at the camp carrying supplies. Crates of food, medicine, and letters marked with strange stamps. The guards opened the boxes under strict supervision. For the first time, the women saw tins of meat, bread, sugar, and even chocolate. The aroma made their stomachs twist with hunger. They had lived on thin rice gruel for so long that the sight of real food was almost unbearable. One guard, a young man barely older than the prisoners, hesitated before handing out rations. His eyes darted between them, uncertain whether to see them as enemies or human beings. When the first can was opened, the women stared in disbelief. Real food. Foreign food. Rich, heavy, fragrant. One woman began to cry quietly. Another whispered, "So this is how they eat." It was not bitterness she felt, but wonder. The enemy, she realized, had been living in a world they could never have imagined, one where abundance was ordinary. As the days passed, the camp's atmosphere shifted. The rigid discipline softened, replaced by a quiet, cautious curiosity. The soldiers who once shouted now spoke in measured tones. Some even smiled awkwardly, as if unsure whether it was allowed. A few of the women began to understand fragments of English. Peace. Home. Safe. They repeated the words to themselves like fragile treasures, their meanings still unfamiliar but warm on the tongue. Still, not everyone could accept what had happened. There were women who refused to believe the surrender was real. They clung to rumors that the emperor had been forced, that a final counterattack was coming, that Japan would rise again. Their faith was unbreakable, even when surrounded by evidence of defeat. Each night, they whispered patriotic songs under their breath, too quietly for the guards to hear. The melodies were fractured, the voices trembling, but the act itself gave them something to hold on to. Others, however, began to change. The surrender had stripped them bare, leaving them exposed to a truth they had never considered, that the world was larger than the empire, and mercy could come from unexpected places. One afternoon, a foreign nurse entered the camp carrying medical supplies. She moved carefully, her uniform crisp, her face calm. She knelt beside one of the Japanese women who had fallen ill and began cleaning her wounds. The Japanese nurse watched in stunned silence, an enemy tending to her like a sister. When the woman thanked her in broken English, the nurse smiled gently and replied, "War is over." That moment, brief, wordless, yet immense, changed something inside her. She realized that compassion could cross boundaries that ideology could not. That kindness, fragile as it was, could survive even the ruins of war. At dusk, the women gathered by the fence, watching the sunset. The sky burned orange and red, the same colors that once flew on their flag. But tonight, it was only a sky, vast, impartial, belonging to no one. They spoke softly of home, of the streets of Osaka and Tokyo, of parents they might never see again. Some tried to remember the sound of the trains, the scent of the sea, the laughter of children playing in courtyards. For the first time in years, they allowed themselves to imagine peace, not as victory but as survival. The surrender had taken everything: pride, nation, identity. But in that emptiness something new began to grow. It was not hope, not yet. It was smaller, quieter. The faint understanding that life would continue, even if nothing else remained the same. One woman, the youngest among them, found a piece of broken glass near the barracks wall. She used it to carve small symbols into the wood. Her name, the date, and the word "still." When asked why, she smiled faintly and said, "Because I am still here." Her words spread through the camp like a spark. Others began marking their names too, not as rebellion, but as remembrance. They had been erased from their homeland, forgotten by their army, but here, in this foreign place, they would not let themselves disappear. The guards saw the carvings but said nothing. Perhaps they understood. Perhaps they were tired, too. In those quiet evenings, when the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the ground, the boundaries between captor and captive blurred. Both sides were haunted by what the war had taken. Both were searching for a way to live with what remained. The surrender had ended the fighting, but it had not ended the war inside them. It lingered in dreams, in memories, in the silence that filled the air between words. The women knew they would carry it for the rest of their lives. The sound of surrender, soft and devastating, like a final breath. And yet, amid that sorrow, there was something beautiful in their endurance. They rose each morning, washed their faces, tended to the sick, shared their rations, and waited for a future that might never come. They had lost their nation, but not their humanity. In their quietness there was strength. In their humility there was grace. Days blurred into weeks. Letters began to arrive, official documents written in both languages, promising eventual repatriation, but no date was given. Time moved slowly, marked only by the rhythm of sunrise and sunset, by the rustle of wind through the barbed wire. In those waiting days, the women began to find small ways to live again. They cleaned the barracks until they shone. They patched torn clothes with thread made from unraveling old blankets. They traded words with the guards. Arigato. Thank you. Peace. They even began to smile again, not from joy but from quiet acceptance. And though they would never forget the humiliation of surrender, many came to see that survival itself was not shameful. To live, to continue breathing, remembering, enduring, was a kind of defiance that no victory or defeat could erase. The empire had fallen, the world had changed. But in that small, forgotten camp, under a sky that belonged to no nation, Japanese women who had once believed in unyielding honor learned something the war had never taught them, that even in surrender, there could be dignity. Days turned into weeks, and the women began to feel the slow, disorienting rhythm of camp life settle around them like a weight. Each day followed the same measured cadence: roll call at dawn, chores assigned by guards whose faces were sometimes stern, sometimes unreadable, meals that were barely enough to sustain life, and hours of waiting. Waiting for orders, for news, for the chance to step beyond the boundaries of barbed wire. In these quiet, suspended days, they discovered a truth they had never imagined. That fate could be cruel, but resilience was crueler still. The world had stripped them bare of status, of homeland, of the familiar certainties they had carried into war. Yet, as the days unfolded, it became apparent that even in captivity, life demanded participation, even in its smallest gestures. Some were sent to labor camps on the outskirts of the islands, performing work that was both grueling and humbling. They cleared debris from abandoned military posts, rebuilt roads that had been destroyed in air raids, and tended to gardens that had been neglected for years. It was hard physical labor, and yet it carried an unexpected gift: the reclamation of purpose. With hands raw and blistered, they planted seeds in the scorched earth, watered them under a relentless sun, and watched life slowly return to the soil. There was a strange, fragile pride in it. A reminder that even in exile, one could cultivate growth. It was as if the universe, indifferent to the battles that had raged, now allowed them this small human dignity. Others were assigned to Allied hospitals, tending to wounded soldiers who had once been their enemies. Initially, fear gripped them. How could they care for those who had inflicted so much pain, whose nations had been the source of so much suffering? Yet, slowly, compassion took hold. They cleaned wounds, changed bandages, and whispered gentle reassurances in a language they had never thought to use in kindness. The paradox of their situation was almost unbearable: to nurture those who could have killed them, to serve those whose flags had marked their suffering. And yet, in the act of giving care, they found a measure of freedom, freedom from the hatred that had shackled them for years. A few women disappeared entirely, transported to other islands or sent on long journeys whose destinations were cloaked in secrecy. Letters were scarce, and news of these missing prisoners trickled in slowly, often distorted or delayed. The uncertainty gnawed at the remaining women, leaving them in a constant state of apprehension. Each day, they measured themselves against absence, wondering who would return and who had been claimed by fate. And yet, even as friends vanished, the survivors discovered an unspoken bond, a solidarity forged not from camaraderie in battle, but from endurance in suffering. The shared silence became a language of its own, each glance and small gesture carrying reassurance, warning, and comfort all at once. Within the barracks, the women began to adapt to the rhythms of a life that was no longer dictated by military hierarchy, but by necessity and survival. They repaired torn clothing, sometimes sewing old sheets into makeshift kimonos, transforming fragments into usable garments. They organized the sparse belongings that the camp allowed, finding small ways to reclaim a sense of order in the chaos around them. In the evenings, they gathered under the open sky, sharing whispered stories of home, songs that had once been forbidden, and memories that had been kept secret even from their closest companions. These acts, simple yet profound, became a way of asserting identity in a place determined to erase it. Gradually, small joys emerged. A patch of sunlight in the barracks would warm the cold floor, offering a moment of comfort. A garden sprouting leaves and buds became a symbol of persistence. The first time one of the women tasted fresh fruit after months of rations, her eyes lit up in a mixture of disbelief and delight. And the others watched, sharing in the rare pleasure. Even mundane tasks like cleaning or fetching water transformed into rituals of survival, acts that reaffirmed their presence in the world and their ability to endure it. The women also began to understand the strange rhythms of power within the camp. The guards, no longer focused solely on punishment, became observers, measuring behavior, testing patience, and occasionally offering small allowances. Some of the soldiers treated the prisoners with a cautious respect, wary of breaking the fragile order yet capable of moments of human kindness. It was these moments, a nod, a word of warning, a ration given without command, that reminded the women that humanity persisted even in places designed to suppress it. As weeks turned into months, the women developed a keen awareness of survival that went beyond obedience. They learned which small acts would draw favor, which could earn extra food or a brief reprieve from labor. They discovered how to communicate with guards in subtle ways, using tone, gesture, or even silence to convey respect without inviting punishment. Each action became calculated, not from fear alone, but from an instinct to preserve life and dignity. This mastery of small interactions was both exhausting and empowering, a delicate dance on the razor's edge between submission and self-preservation. Despite the monotony and hardship, a quiet resilience took root. The women cultivated a sense of agency, however limited, within the narrow confines of their world. They organized communal activities, shared meals, quiet discussions about the future, and even small forms of entertainment. They created a web of relationships that provided emotional sustenance. In these connections, they discovered strength, learning that endurance was not merely a personal act, but a collective one. The bonds formed in adversity became a lifeline, a reminder that even in captivity, they were not alone. Nighttime brought its own revelations. Under the vast, indifferent sky, they would sometimes gather to watch the stars, their light untainted by city or empire. In these moments, they whispered lullabies, told stories of childhoods left behind, and imagined futures that seemed almost impossible. The act of imagining, of picturing a life beyond the barbed wire, became a subtle rebellion against fate. It was an assertion that though they were prisoners in body, their minds remained free. Through these months, the women came to understand that their suffering was not unique, but part of a larger pattern of loss and endurance experienced by countless others in the aftermath of war. They bore witness to the collapse of empires, the shifting allegiances of nations, and the quiet perseverance of those who survived. Each small act of resilience, planting a garden, sewing a garment, tending to a wounded enemy, was a testament to human adaptability. It was an acknowledgement that even in circumstances designed to break them, the spirit could endure. The camp itself became a classroom of survival. Lessons were learned in the minutiae of daily life: how to conserve energy, how to stretch rations, how to maintain dignity when stripped of rank, how to communicate when words failed. Each woman adapted these lessons to her own strengths, creating strategies that allowed her to navigate the delicate balance between endurance and despair. Over time, this accumulation of knowledge became second nature, a quiet mastery born of necessity. Some of the women found solace in creativity. They drew, wrote, and sang, reclaiming fragments of their culture and identity. A sketch of Mount Fuji, a poem about home, a song hummed quietly at dusk. Each was a thread connecting them to the world they had lost and the world they still hoped to return to. These acts of expression were small acts of defiance against erasure, proof that even when fate dealt a harsh hand, the human spirit could weave beauty from hardship. Months passed. The women grew stronger, both in body and in mind. They learned to recognize the patterns of life in captivity, the timing of supplies, the routines of the gods, the subtle shifts in mood that could signal change. This knowledge became a shield against despair, a way to assert control in an environment designed to strip it away. And in that process, they discovered a new form of power: the quiet, steady will to endure. Even when faced with uncertainty, the occasional disappearance of a friend, the arrival of new prisoners, or the unknown timeline of repatriation, the women found a way to persist. They developed rituals to mark time, to honor those who had gone, and to preserve their sense of self. These rituals, whether tending a garden, repairing a garment, or carving names into the walls, became sacred acts of survival. They were reminders that though fate could remove freedom, it could not erase identity. By the time letters began arriving promising eventual repatriation, the women had been changed irrevocably. They had learned patience in a new, harsher form, endurance that was both physical and emotional, and resilience that transcended circumstance. Each day, each small act of perseverance had strengthened them in ways that were invisible to the outside world but vital to their survival. They were no longer merely prisoners. They were survivors, architects of a quiet rebellion against despair, custodians of dignity in the ruins of a lost empire. Though history would often overlook them, these Japanese women prisoners had endured in ways few could imagine. They had faced fate and found within themselves a stubborn, unwavering will to survive. They had transformed the emptiness of captivity into a space where resilience could take root, where the human spirit, though tested and battered, could flourish quietly and without recognition. Their legacy would not be written in the chronicles of battles or the triumphs of nations, but in the indomitable endurance they displayed in the face of unimaginable circumstance.